Welcome in everyone, it's Mr. Smith and welcome to tonight's ATW where we're going to do two topics. The first, the Black Death. Ooh, nasty. And then the second, we're going to mix in some good. We'll end on a good note, the Renaissance. So let's get down to our first ATW of 2021. In years past, I always had to teach my students what the word pandemic means, but I think given everything we've experienced this year with COVID, we certainly have a good understanding of what that word means. The Black Death, in comparison to our current global pandemic, the Black Death was arguably one of the most traumatic and scarring experiences in the history of humanity. The Black Death, to give you a broad sense, coming right out of the gate here with a hard fact, the Black Death is believed to have killed an estimated, now we can't say with certainty because record keeping back in the mid-1300s was not nearly as strong as it is today, but it is estimated that the Black Death killed possibly on the high end, the very high end, about 75 million people. Okay, so knowing that statistic, if that number holds up, and that is in fact the number of people that died as a result of this cataclysmic pandemic in the mid-1300s, how the heck does something like this happen? Well, we have a lot of lessons we can take away from the COVID pandemic to understand how and why the Black Death killed so many people. Speaking of the Black Death, there's another name I'm going to use that you could go with that works here, the bubonic plague. Oftentimes you'll see the Black Death and the bubonic plague used sort of interchangeably, so I'll be using those throughout the video to go back and forth. But when you look at the Black Death, let's first talk about when it started spreading. It's impossible to pinpoint the year precisely because, again, we don't have that type of record keeping or acknowledgement of when exactly this microbacteria began killing millions of people. But historians believe that in the mid-1300s or mid-14th century is when the Black Death first began to wreak havoc. And what we know from early records is that the Black Death started somewhere in or nearby China. That's sort of interesting when you consider that the COVID-19 virus began in Wuhan, China last winter. So something that just historically coincidental there is that two of the worst pandemics in human history did originate in or around China. What carried the virus from insects, which was the Black Death, the original strain of the virus, was first carried by insects. Fleas began spreading the disease from rodents like mice and rats and gerbils, and eventually fleas also hopped into horses, camels, and that's what scientists believe is really what was the triggering effect that led to the disease, the Black Death disease, going from insects to animals to eventually humans. Something that we can relate to in our modern times is that COVID has spread mostly through human contact. And even though fleas were the carriers of the disease in the bubonic plague era of the mid-1300s, human contact is what ultimately spread both these ravaging pandemics. With COVID-19, anti-maskers, people traveling under, lockdown, people mixing it up, going to gatherings. We know the story, we've read this too much. In the Middle Ages, you're dealing more with trade and contact that people came into as a result of trade routes, which was one of the main theories as to how this virus goes from China to South Asia, to the Middle East, to North Africa, to the Byzantine Empire, to Western Europe, to Eastern Europe, all over Afro-Eurasia. And one of the main carriers of the disease were along trade routes. By the mid-1300s, the Silk Roads was a well-oiled machine of global trade. People were exchanging goods from China to the Byzantine Empire, to North Africa, to the Islamic caliphates in Western Europe, into the Holy Roman Empire. Trade was booming, especially after the Crusades. But that was also a harbinger of death, because trade routes, and not just the Silk Roads, like ocean travel in the Indian Ocean, something we'll talk about later on this month, was also peaking. And as a result of how increased trade was really becoming, you have to consider that trade was one of the great catalysts for how the Black Death would go on to kill so many millions of Afro-Eurasian peoples. Again, human contact, though, is what really triggered this massive pandemic. People lived foul, miserable, disgusting lives back in the mid-1300s. People threw feces and sewage and garbage in the streets. They lived right alongside their animals. And so the world back then was just much grimier, much dirtier, much more nefarious in a way than it is today. And that's probably why when you look at the death toll, you're talking about entire villages, cities nearly being wiped out. Western Europe was absolutely decimated by the time the plague arrived in the late 1340s. You have some villages in France where almost 75% of the entire population were destroyed and killed. I mean, the numbers are staggering, and the hard thing about this is we don't know the numbers exactly because, again, record keeping just wasn't as accurate as it is. Typically, it was the Catholic Church that kept a lot of the records in towns because priests were some of the few people that had the ability to read and write. Aside from that, again, we're aiming high in the numbers. What we just have to take away looking at this from our perspective today is just how much carnage. And it wasn't just one city or one town or one empire. I mean, it was almost all of Afro-Eurasia as you're seeing on these maps. But interestingly, the plague did not spread beyond Afro-Eurasia. It didn't go to the Americas, and there's a pretty simple reason why. People weren't crossing the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean at this time. But the big takeaway I want you to look at is, the effects on people as a result of this sort of catastrophe. First and foremost, religion took a real hard hit as a result of the Black Plague, and you can imagine why. The Catholic Church was the most powerful organization in Western Europe and other parts of Europe. Islam, we know, dominated North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East. And so, as a result, people must have come into a real crisis of faith with seeing how much death, was surrounding them. So religion took a hit when it came to the Black Death. Another unfortunate consequence, number 2, of the Black Death is that within Europe especially, many Jewish people who were living amongst Christian communities were scapegoated and targeted as the creators of the Black Death. And this is simply pure racist, anti-Semitic, that means hatred of Jewish people, by the way. Pure and simple, it was racist, prejudiced thinking that people didn't understand what caused the virus, and so you fear what you don't understand, right? And people began to go after Jewish people. There were mob attacks. Jewish people were forced out of their houses and their towns, and they were forced to spread into various parts of Europe and Africa as a result of these attacks and as a result of the scapegoating. So very interesting. Looking back now, we know for sure that Jewish people were often targeted as the causes of the Black Death, although certainly it was not Jewish people at all. Another important effect is science. Right? This is a test for science at the time, and there really is very little science, but there are, sort of those grim Reaper-like images of medicine men, that went around and tried to treat people with the long beak. You'll see that in the video here. But people wore those long beak masks that have now become popular around the Halloween time of the year. Medicine really was unequipped, and science was nowhere near capable of treating this disease. If you caught the disease, the symptoms were vicious. You're seeing a primary source right now of what someone said, how they described. Oh, God, just gives you the heebie-jeebies. But the bottom line is, this was a test for science unlike anything else. And again, there really was no science. And I think that's important to recognize as one of the effects. This would prompt science and prompt people to take the study of diseases and illnesses much more seriously moving forward into different times in human history. And then the fourth effect I wanted to bring to your attention was cultural effect. People began to draw and complete amazing artworks in the post-pandemic era of the mid-1300s in order to sort of wrestle and rectify the experiences that they had with seeing carnage on this scale. And so there's some tremendously famous and beautiful artwork that came out of the Black Death era. And again, it demonstrates what we've seen in our modern day times with memes and the way that we use social media to cope with the negative effects of the virus. People back then took to writing and they took to painting to sort of escape, in a sense, from the Black Death. And that's a really good segue to part 2 of our video, which is going to focus on cultural growth after the Black Death, especially in Europe. So I'm going to be very European heavy here now for the next segment of our video, because what happened in Europe as a result of the Black Death, I already mentioned Europe was one of the areas hit the hardest by the Black Death. But interestingly, out of the ashes of all those millions of lives that were lost in the Black Death, Europe is going to be reborn culturally. And this is the era in world history known as the Renaissance. Literally translated from French, Renaissance means rebirth. And that's exactly what happened to European culture after the Black Death. Figuratively. Literally, though, you could say that Europe was reborn because so many people had died. And now, the population, once the disease began to lessen in its deadly deadly effects, the birth rate began to skyrocket. And so people were literally being reborn, but also figuratively being reborn in the sense that a new European mentality and philosophy began to spread almost as fast as the pandemic did. And interestingly, it spread for the same reasons: human contact and trade. And the idea that whenever you think of the Renaissance and you think of culture, one idea that you want to definitely think about is known as humanism. Humanism is the central dogma or idea or ideology that comes out of the Renaissance. Humanism is, for lack of a better term, a 14th century YOLO. You only live once. And if you survived the Black Death and you saw family, neighbors, people around you suffering those heinous deaths, you probably had a different life perspective after surviving the Black Death. And that's exactly what began to happen with people who converted, so to speak, to this new philosophy, humanism. Humanism focused on life on earth. Instead of putting all your chips in the afterlife, if you're a Christian, right, going to heaven, people began to stress the idea, let's live for the moment. Let's live in our era. Let's focus on art. Let's focus on literature. Let's focus on developing our culture here. Culture had been stymied. There was very little cultural growth in Europe as a result of the plague. The Renaissance, you can definitely trace its origins to one country in Europe, by the way, and that would be Italy. Italy was at the heart of the Mediterranean Sea travel and trade. It was in perfect location. Italy, by the way, at this time was not an empire. It was a collection of city-states. And these city-states like Florence, Genoa, Rome, Naples, Venice, these were wealthy city-states. And wealthy people wanted to spend their money. Remember, it's humanism or YOLO, 13th century or 1300 style. So people are spending money and they're investing in schools. They're investing in businesses. They're investing in art because that's what rich people like to do. They like to show off and flex their art. Patrons begin to pay for artists to come to their houses, to come to their churches. And so what starts in Italy is this sort of fad, if you will, that, whoa, look at what they're doing in Florence. They're building these gorgeous churches. They're building these amazing statues. They're painting these amazing frescoes. And oh my God, we've got to have this in our city-state. And sort of this sort of competitiveness, to have the next great piece of art or produce the next great book starts to happen in Italy. And from there, boom, this has like a viral type effect. And it's interesting how with the Black Death, human contact and trade was one of the main reasons it was so deadly. But with the Renaissance, it's the same thing, but in the opposite direction. The ideas of the Renaissance, like humanism, and the artwork that begins to be produced, the books that begin to be written, the inventions that begin, like, for example, the printing press, which came about in the mid-1400s, was during the heart of the Renaissance. Johann Gutenberg, a German, invented the printing press and would forever change the world as a result of his Renaissance invention. Gutenberg's printing press allowed for the spread of information through books to be printed much quicker than ever before. Now, granted, the Chinese were the first to invent any type of printing. We talked about that on one of the ATWs earlier. But the Renaissance was all about this rebirth of culture. Education becomes a priority. New schools and universities are built. Science becomes a bona fide area that people begin to study with passion. Literature begins to grow. And above all, art begins to flourish in this time period. Unknowingly, I was exposed to Renaissance art as a little kid when I would watch my favorite TV show, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Heck yeah. Leonardo, Donatello, Raphael, Michelangelo. Little did little Mr. Smith know that the 4 Ninja Turtles that I used to root for against the bad guys in the cartoon were actually named after famous Renaissance artists. Now don't worry, the purpose of Team Trivia tomorrow is not all about art, but we are gonna dive into art of the Renaissance, and we will look at some of the Ninja Turtle works, and some of these you may be surprised. You may know already who some of these Ninja Turtle artists were. But to further help you understand how to decipher and kind of identify Renaissance art, I'm gonna bring in an art history expert to give you guys a little extra knowledge for the ATW and also moving forward as you gain a greater appreciation for art. So here's our special guest to welcome into this ATW.
Hello everyone, I am Miss Lynn. I'm an art teacher and I will briefly be describing some characteristics of Renaissance art. So one major development was the discovery of linear perspective. This basically means that the lines in a painting appear to vanish, or they go back into the painting and vanish in one point. This was one method to create the illusion of depth. Ever since its discovery in the Renaissance, artists have been using it ever since. So you can think of a couple of paintings when you think about linear perspective. You can think about Leonardo's The Last Supper and Raphael's The School of Athens. Another major characteristic of Renaissance art is a pyramid or a triangular composition. Basically, that means that the painting is arranged symmetrically with the focal point at the top. This creates a pyramid or a triangle, and it also creates the feeling of stability. So you can think about Michelangelo's Pieta or Raphael's Madonna and Child. The last characteristic I'm going to talk about is realism. In painting, this was accomplished through the use of light and shadow. So think about Leonardo's Mona Lisa. Light and shadow makes things look more 3D. In sculpture, to make things look realistic, contrapposto was used. So that means that the person is posed in a way that they lean on one leg more than the other. It looks more natural that way instead of being very rigid looking. Think about Donatello's David, for example.
Well, Ms. Lynn, thank you, and we appreciate your time here on the video. I appreciate for all my students your efforts going into this ATW. So I'm going to wrap things up by reminding you about how, again, when you think Renaissance, you've got to think about rebirth, and that could come in a variety of different ways, whether it's cultural, whether it's science, whether it's any of the aspects of art that were mentioned by Miss Lynn. Renaissance means rebirth, and we're going to focus on that rebirth and think about how Europe is going to be transformed into a region of the world that would soon go on to become the most powerful center in the world. And it won't be long in world history till we start talking about Europeans going off into different parts of the world, conquering and taking over and bringing all sorts of new changes to the world. And you can always trace that back to the Renaissance. So that's it for tonight. I'm going to get back to the Georgia elections and check on who's winning down there. As always, I'll end things by reminding you the past shapes the future. Take care, everyone.